welcome you all to this first keynote session of early 2017. I think we have a very, very exciting speaker here today, and it is a great honor and a pleasure for me to introduce to you Professor Dr. Manfred Prenzel. Manfred is the holder of the Susanne Klatten Endowed Chair at the Technical University of Munich, chairman of the German Council of Science and Humanities, and holder of a whole range of awards, prizes and distinctions in our field. He is one of the leading researchers in the field of both learning and instruction, and also of large-scale international student assessment studies. He has, for example, led the PISA team in Germany, the very interesting PISA Plus project in Germany, and has also been working on studies of trajectories of future teachers, so very much in line with the topic of today. Professor Prenzel is a big friend and supporter of our organization, having in the past been a member of the executive committee and also the organizer of the Munich EARLI conference in 2013. And those of you who were there can remember what an excellent conference that was. Those of you who were here at the panel session will have already heard some of his very insightful ideas on the relationship between research and policy. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Prenzel to speak to us today about evidence-based education and the role of teacher education.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for that very kind introduction. For me, it's a fantastic feeling to be here. It's a pleasure to see you all here. And for me, it's a big honor being invited to present a keynote here on the EARLI conference in Tampere. Thanks for the appreciation. Thanks for inviting me, and special thanks to the SIG 11 and the EARLI EC for giving me the possibility for that talk today. My talk will deal with evidence-based education, and I would like to focus especially later on evidence-based teacher education. But I would like to start with some personal experiences. Someone who is fond of reading crime stories as much as me, sooner or later will be confronted with evidence. This slide is dedicated to the colleagues here who share my interest in crime stories, and it shows a hot recommendation. I strongly recommend to read the books of Pentti Kirstilä and Seppo Jokinen, both covering exciting criminal cases in Tampere. Some of their books are available and translated into different languages. So Tampere seems to be a very fine place for conferences as well as for crime acts. My message to all the colleagues here who are not interested but possibly afraid of crimes is the following. You don't have to worry, because in Tampere there are also very bright detectives working like Lauri Hanivara and Sakari Koskinen, and they successfully maintain law and order. They know how to find, and also they know how to interpret evidence, also in very complicated cases. Personally, it took me some years until I realized that the word evidence, I knew from crime stories, is even important in my own professional work. If you think a little bit about that, we have also in educational system victims, and you can think about the number of victims. There's some kind of inequity, and there are factors that account for the differences in performance, for example, and opportunities for life. But in educational research, it is not possible to arrest someone because of educational system is not providing the justice that you think it's necessary. During the last 2 decades, the term evidence was more and more frequently used in the context of education, not only as a label for more or less convincing findings or indicators. Rather, the word evidence seems to stand for some kind of superior program, movement, or paradigm in education. As you have heard in the introduction, there had been several research fields where I've been involved: video studies in physics lessons, large-scale approaches to improve the quality of science and math teaching, studies on the perception of lessons, or some kind of experimental studies on the effect of different types of training in teacher education. All these studies established something that can be called evidence. A number of these studies involved dialogues with teachers and the transfer of evidence to professionals. But the most interesting and controversial discussions on evidence occurred in the context of PISA, where I had been involved for many years. As a national project manager of several PISA cycles, you find many opportunities to discuss findings of this international comparative study, but also to discuss issues of design, limitations, or possibilities to improve the quality or the evidence resulting from such large-scale assessments. For someone with a background in research, PISA confronts with an interesting tension. On the one hand, PISA is an international comparative study with a cross-sectional design, with strong assessments and a fantastic sample, a sample, however, that passes over the level of classrooms. PISA provides an excellent instrument for monitoring educational systems, but PISA is also used as a tool for benchmarking. There was, and I think there still is, a tendency to strain this function of benchmarking. And this is a point where tension arises, when findings and reports are interpreted as evidence for something, especially for something to do. But the quality of that evidence and of the conclusions have to be seriously doubted by scientific reasons. In my country, the national PISA management was and is led by researchers. It was our interest to combine PISA with research, to use a fantastic sample for additional studies. Let me give you 3 examples. The first example is very simple. Introducing a second day of assessment, we used an additional day for a national curriculum-based assessment in order to compare the outcome, the performance in both types of assessment. That was already in PISA 2000. The latent correlation between both assessments had been up to 0.90. So we could show that the poor performance in Germany was not caused by an alien assessment, and that we had real problems attaining basic objectives of our curriculum. Secondly, an oversampling for the purpose of national comparisons was extremely important to prevent simplistic interpretations of effects of the German school system. Our data showed huge differences in performance between the 16 federal states, differences nearly in the scope of differences between all OECD countries. And the federal states differed also surprisingly with respect to indicators of equal opportunities. These findings prevented hasty decisions towards changes of the basic structure of schooling in Germany. The third example is a follow-up study we implemented in PISA 2003. The whole PISA sample, and I have to add an oversampling of 2 complete classes per school, was tested in the following year in math and science. As you can see on the slide, the performance in math increased in the course of 1 year of schooling by 25 points. But as the scatter plot also shows, there has been a big part of students who did not improve. These students, however, did not fail, and nearly all of them passed the school year successfully. It seems they knew how to master the numerous teacher-made tests during the course of the year. An assessment at the end of an year or after a longer period, however, shows that this type of short-term learning and also short-term oriented teaching is not sustainable and a relevant part of the problem of our school system, at least in Germany. And as it seems, there is not enough cumulative progress in learning and teaching. Maybe it's interesting to know that this follow-up dataset of PISA 2003 served as a basis for the analysis of the instructional effects and the impact of teacher competences and the so-called coactive study of Mareike Kunter, Jürgen Baumert and other colleagues. The slide shows important relations between the different constructs on the levels of teacher, instruction and student outcome that had been analyzed in the study. I will come back to the study later on because it provided relevant evidence for teacher education. These three mentioned examples of extensions to PISA represent different ways to combine research with an interest in providing evidence with some relevance for political decision and science as well. At least it seems that some of these attempts also showed some effects. The perception of what can be called evidence and the appraisal of what kind of evidence is useful or helpful, these are reasons why I wanted to share some thoughts about evidence-based policy, practice and teacher education in my talk today. Let me go on now with some basic reflections on the concept of evidence. The term evidence has different meanings depending on disciplines or professions. Humanities and philosophy grasp evidence as a personal experience, as some kind of direct and apparent insight into truth. For social and natural scientists, however, empirical findings that support or challenge a conjecture, a hypothesis, is understood as evidence. So in social sciences and in education, researchers have always been producing evidence. They did that in the natural context of their research. For example, they discussed with colleagues whether certain data or method were more or less convincing evidence to support theoretical conjectures. And the discussion parts of their articles, they were thinking about possible fields of application of their findings. Yet evidence primarily was a topic of an insider discussion in a plain research context. This former context has been systematically expanded during the last years. Nowadays, evidence is provided and delivered also to communities outside of research. From a research perspective, you may appreciate this development because it underlines the relevance of our research. Another positive aspect can be seen in the fact that education research offering findings, insights, or evidence breaks open to other or specific parts of society, of a society that in the end is funding our research. The slide shows different communities that could be interested in evidence from research and education. Some of these communities would even expect, wish, or demand evidence from research and education. In the following, I will focus first of all the first two groups. What can be reasons for the potential interest in evidence from education research? Why should other communities recognize or use evidence from educational research? At least for education policy and professional education practice applies one basic principle of reasonable action and rational decision. Decisions or actions should be based on the best available knowledge. And knowledge that has been empirically improved in research tends to be the best knowledge. However, if it's available and if it's suitable for the situation and for the problem at hand. However, evidence resulting from educational research does not exist as a piece of something. It is always related to what? To some kind of statement. For example, propositions, conjectures, hypotheses, or sets of statements. Evidence resulting from empirical research may serve different purposes in evidence-based education. I would like to differentiate here a number of functions. For example, the function of description. That means to describe states, processes, performances. Or the function of evaluation. That means to relate observed outcomes to objectives, for example. Or prediction, to predict processes or certain output referring to conditions. Prediction may also include the prediction of differences in variance. Explanation in a more narrow sense, the identification of causal factors. And intervention or providing knowledge for change, that means dealing with options of actions, measures, but always related to goals. For example, treatments to obtain goals under certain initial conditions. Evidence related to these functions may generally enrich the knowledge base of stakeholders, professionals, or it can be considered in specific situations where decisions have to be made. Such a functional view on evidence has the advantage that different types of research findings can be considered evidence. The evidence movement, if you want to call it that way, is a relatively young enterprise in education and educational research. There are, however, quite a number of challenges. I would like to mention at least 3 of these challenges. The first challenge, to identify the best evidence. That's a challenge because of the richness of research. There are huge differences in the samples, in the constructs, in the assessment, in the instruments. There are huge differences in the quality of research, depending on the methods that have been used. We also have the problem now that when there is a lot of research, we have controversial findings. We have findings coming from one first study in a field and say it's some kind of fragile evidence. So that's one of the big challenges, to identify what can be called best evidence. A second issue is identification of the suitability of evidence. Does the evidence fit with the situation or with the problem at hand that I have to deal with as a politician or as a professional? And there's a tension between the tendency, between the very important characteristic of research to produce generalizable findings, theories that can be generalized on certain different situations. And on the other hand, the demands for getting very specific explanations, descriptions, predictions for a very certain situation. And the third challenge is the lack of evidence in certain areas. For treatments, for example, or interventions in general, we have a problem because of the fit with very concrete situations. And also with respect to different goals, to different initial states we will find in reality, and different context factors. But these challenges seem to be addressed by, for example, systematic reviews. However, systematic reviews must not cover all the fields of research that could be interesting or relevant for potential users. Even excellent research synthesis will not exactly cover a situation at hand. So users of evidence have to often transfer evidence to the respective situation or problem, and this transfer process is not an easy process. And it's the same with the what works approaches. There are many specific constellations where you cannot draw back on such elaborated synthesis. Again, here transfer is needed, or you have to go into the research findings themselves. Of course, these promises of this evidence-oriented movement have been doubted from different sides. Maybe some of you may remember a discussion we had in an invited symposium in Exeter together with Gerd Piester or Martin Hammersley. Gerd Piester, for example, formulated very fundamental concerns: knowledge deficit, and application deficit, and efficacy deficit. But there are also some current concerns presented, for example, in the Educational Researcher, for example, by Catherine Snow or Anthony Brick. They ask for new research designs, they ask for new paradigms that go beyond the recent movement on evidence orientation. I have the impression that most of the critiques of evidence-based education, first of all, tend to be a critique of the current research in education. It is criticized to be not enough related to the needs or interests of users. Evidence movements, that the argument maybe misunderstands these needs and is not acquainted with the specific constellations of educational practice. So one argument of recent critics can be taken up. We need more dialogue with educational practice and also dialogue with education policy. We need strategic partnership, that's the argument of Catherine Snow, that could orient research programs. It is also worthwhile to reflect possibilities to extend our conventional research approaches in the direction of the suggested improvement paradigm, for example, of Anthony Brick. But we also have to keep the strengths of our theory-driven research, of research exploring new ideas, of research programs that consolidate our scientific knowledge. I'm always surprised and hesitating when, after a relatively short time of advancing a certain research approach or paradigm, the next one is declared and started. For me, the promises of evidence-related research are still valid, but I think we should strengthen the feedback potential with systematic reviews, and I would like to show that a little bit later. And also, I'm not quite sure about the side effects new paradigms like the improvement paradigm of Anthony Brick will present, because they are really strongly oriented towards the needs of practice. And as I mentioned, we need maybe more research combining basic research with applied research, with research that ends up in the classroom. Yesterday I mentioned the example of translational research in medicine, where there is an attempt to have chains between these different levels of research. However, the basic principles of the evidence approach are shown on the slide. In a certain field, you find a range of pertinent studies that will be considered via meta-analysis, review processes. The findings will be selected, rectified, aggregated, evidence will be condensed, possibly conditioned with regard to objectives, domains, initial states maybe. And also important, in the research synthesis, for example, the evidence can be edited, addressed to specific target groups. Obviously, the success of such an approach depends strongly on the amount of pertinent studies, their quality, their relationship to practice, their respective area of application, and especially their relevance. From my point of view, the evidence-oriented approach helps to carve out evidence with potential for educational practice. Meta-analysis, research reviews and synthesis might have an important influence on research because they provide very interesting feedback to researchers. They mirror to what extent and in which way studies are contributing to cumulative knowledge, stabilizing or extending evidence at hand. They sketch the research landscape and show where important construction zones for further research will be, with respect to coverage, but also with regard to fragile or controversial pieces of evidence. Thus, the approach towards evidence-based education using such approaches can be seen as a blueprint of a feedback system to research, a feedback system for steering researchers towards research with more potential and relevance for substantiating evidence. And I think that's what we need from my point of view. Yesterday, linked to the open ceremony, we had an interesting panel discussion dealing with the relationship between education policy and research. I would like to discuss only some points in brief now. Education policy in most countries nowadays naturally uses data, asks for statistics, establishes monitoring systems. From a policy perspective, evidence, and especially evidence from research, is crucial for identifying problems in the education system, for clarifying options, including effort or short and long-term or side effects, and for justifying decisions. One has to say that education policy is only considering evidence in decision processes. Policy is not only considering evidence. Policy takes evidence into account. It is not basing decisions on evidence, because policy considers not only evidence from research, but also a number of very different information in relation to their goals with different purposes and related to different values. This observation may give reason to talk weakening about evidence-informed policy. Anyhow, the relationship between policy and research is characterized by several activities, functions, and dependencies. These are, however, very differently developed between countries, but also within countries. In general, one can say that the demand for the amount and quality of evidence has increased. And in many countries, a tendency can be observed to link the funding of educational research to top-down programs with clear defined expectations concerning the content and the quality of studies in education. Education policy that demands or uses evidence is characterized by a number of specifics. Policy is oriented to different types of goals. It is also important to understand that policy has the power to fix overall educational objectives, maybe requiring parliamentary discussions and consent, but they have the possibility. The influence and power policy has means that in the end, policy carries responsibility, and this perceived responsibility may reduce the relevance of evidence in their decision processes. In the end, policy is dependent on voters and timelines of elections, so policy prefers measures with a high visibility and short-term success. And finally, there is some dependency or interplay between the operational level. I mentioned already different relationships and dependencies between education research and education policy. Some of the issues on this slide have been discussed yesterday, just after the opening ceremony. Also there it was emphasized that the dialogue between researchers and stakeholders from policy plays an important role in order to develop mutual trust. The communication between both sides is confronted with the challenges of dealing with fragile and conflicting evidence. The different time frames of policy and research have to be aligned, and long-term perspectives are needed. I think I've mentioned a number of reasons why evidence-based decisions of policy, first of all, refer to the design of structural conditions of the education system. Yet there are many and very different leverage points for political decisions, reforms and programs. Most of the evidence at hand, however, shows only small relevance of differences or changes in very basic structural elements of an educational system. Instead, it seems that the functional interplay, the interaction of different structures and various components of the school or even the education system is more important. For example, the coherence or the alignment towards superior goals or the interplay between different subsystems, for example, for curriculum development or teacher education or quality management. The slide gives an overview on possible points of leverage. Problems frequently seem to result from fragmented subsystems, insufficient support and insufficient coordination, lack of flexibility or subsidiarity or oversteering, too many changes at a time, the lack of feedback loops. Most important for education policy, therefore, is research that considers the school or the educational system and helps to understand the relationships, the dependencies, and the interplay of different subsystems. One of the very relevant subsystems is teacher education, including initial teacher education as well as lifelong professional development. My first point concerning the perception of the relevance of teacher education is very simple. Due to a huge amount of evidence from research, the focus of education policy during the last decades shifted step by step from distal factors of learning, for example, basic structures of the school system, to more proximal factors of learning in classrooms. And especially proximal factors which can be affected and shaped seem to be of special relevance. During the last decades, research emphasized, and there is many evidence that teaching matters, that teachers matter, and that education matters. So let's have a look on teacher education in Europe. During the last 2 decades, initial teacher education in European countries was shaped by the Bologna process. It has to be emphasized that the goal of the Bologna process was a broad reform of higher education aiming at a harmonization of study paths with the purpose of increasing the international compatibility of studies and degrees. First of all, this was a political goal with respect to an open European labor market and not induced by some kind of evidence from very current research from education. But the Bologna process was not confined to formal structures of study courses. Bologna claimed that curricula and contents have to be oriented around professionally relevant competencies. And there are 2 important requirements for curricula in higher education. The first one, competences have to be defined as intended outcomes of studies. And second, these competences should be related to requirements of professional fields, sometimes called with respect to employability. Thus, the framework for studies in higher education brought a number of severe consequences for teacher education. The consequences touched the kind of institution responsible for initial teacher education, tending to be more and more the universities, the length of the studies, and the kind of degrees, academic degrees on the level of master, for example. The initiated process of harmonization implied a convergence towards more elaborated and academic models of initial teacher education in European countries. For example, Finland as such a model, or you can find it also in some other Nordic countries. So it has to be highlighted that key components of the teacher education reform in Europe have not been inspired by specific research on teacher education. They were more or less a side effect of the general reform of higher education in European countries. The consequences for teacher education, however, seem to be desired by teacher unions and expert panels of the European Commission or of the OECD. And the basic structure, as well as the curricular concept, aiming at professional competences and output, coincided with the, at this time, remarkably advancing research on teaching and teacher competences. Accordingly, some more interesting developments in conceptions of teacher education in Europe could be observed. In 2012, for example, Johannes Bauer and me counted at least 20 countries that had established national standards and guidelines for teacher education. First, establishing standards means that the autonomy of single universities to shape their teacher education was constrained by education policy. You can interpret that as some kind of political attempt to control the universities, because it was quite uncertain whether the rectorates would be even convinced by evidence or personal beliefs of the relevance of teacher education. Secondly, these standards for teacher education increasingly were and are based on an understanding of teaching as a research-based profession. And here you can see or feel real impact of educational research, because that idea did not originate from the heads of education policy. Such national standards also included demands for training in research methods or in research projects. In some countries, for example Finland, or also in my country, there's an explicit claim to develop competences in teacher education that are necessary and relevant for evidence-based practice. For me, this is an interesting intensification of research competencies in the direction of competencies that are relevant for evidence-based educational practice as well as for lifelong professional development. As I insinuated before, research on teaching and teacher education increased remarkably, and progress in assessment techniques allowed to have a closer look at competencies that teachers could or should have developed. Some years later, the reform of initial teacher education has to go on. The OECD, for example, said reforms in teacher education curriculum need to be conducted in line with evidence-based research in order to equip prospective teachers with sufficient pedagogical content knowledge and classroom practice, as well as content knowledge. This statement contains a number of keywords: content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, thereby referring to distinctions of Lee Schulman and to a, in meantime, widely held idea of the structure of teachers' competencies. The statement also speaks for evidence-based research in the field of teacher education. Here is an opportunity to come back to one study I have mentioned before. From my point of view, this study, the coactive study and the model, stand for a real breakthrough in the research on teacher competencies. In the coactive project, assessments of different types of teacher knowledge were used to predict differences in their teaching patterns and in the performance of the students in their classrooms. Especially differences in content knowledge and in pedagogical content knowledge were found to predict relevant differences in teaching and in outcomes. The approach used in this project stimulated other research and got of exposure by stakeholders in policy. Although this model turned out to be extremely fruitful in research, it is not easy to use evidence from this kind of research to back up decisions on curricular priorities or on the course of studies in teacher education. Let me argue with one very concrete question. How much time in terms of credit points should be devoted to students' learning of content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, or pedagogical or psychological knowledge? This refers to the question how much of knowledge or training and what will be sufficient. In order to answer such questions, we need additional and other types of research. Maybe I have to develop the argument a bit further. Considering teacher education, for example, in European countries, you may find a range of 30 to 100 or 120 or even more ECTS points for studies of the subject, means content knowledge. The assessment used in coactive and also in TEDS-M, for example, do not cover the very specific and highly sophisticated contents that are taught in studies with a high amount of ECTS points, maybe 100. Of course, teachers who went through these studies successfully will outperform teachers from other studies with smaller amounts of ECTS points. However, we do not know how sustainable this pretentious knowledge will be and how this knowledge may contribute to the quality of teaching. Thus, for an evidence-based design of the curriculum for teacher education, we would need additional studies and also other kinds of studies, for example, systematic evaluation designs, and it would be especially interesting to run here internationally comparative studies, for example, in Finland and in other countries. My second point, how can we step by step merge these different types of knowledge in order to develop a viable and coherent competence for teaching? And what could be an appropriate curriculum which develops a competence for teaching in a way that the students will be able to teach in high quality? Content knowledge, psychological knowledge, and even pedagogical content knowledge from research is not sufficient to develop necessary competences for teaching. In my opinion, we do need more research that turns psychological approaches or the assessment of teacher competences into educational approaches, or formulated in a different way, most current studies on teacher competences are providing evidence that is helpful for explanations. But our research has to be advanced towards approaches that help to develop and improve basic competences for teaching. So I would suggest to turn or combine structural models of teacher competencies towards developmental models of these competencies. My next slide will present a different kind of model of teacher competencies, and this model refers to the standards for teacher education in my country. This model describes teacher competencies in a different and more functional way. It has an interface to structural competence models, but also differentiates functional and procedural facets of teacher competencies. Bringing both models together would produce some kind of theory for the teacher education curriculum. Modules of such a curriculum could be analyzed and empirically tested using experimental designs. However, I want to emphasize that this slide presents a very specific and national example, and there might be very different ways to explicate models in a national educational system. But again, my argument is we need more comparative studies on the development of a full range of teachers or the student teachers' competences in the course of their studies at the university, and depending on the system, also during their internship. Discussing this idea on an early conference could be seen as an idea to do more research of this type in European countries. At least we have with Bologna a certain kind of reference system with several communalities. However, for such studies, we would need a wide range of methods besides assessment. First of all, for example, also video analysis of teaching in classrooms at certain times during the course of the studies. I already talked about the promises of systematic reviews and research synthesis for evidence-based practice, and it's obvious that teacher education can benefit from these approaches. All the current attempts to synthesize evidence from educational research are very important for teacher education. They are providing real substance and are very helpful for anyone in teacher education. That is not only true for initial teacher education, but also for professional teacher development. Until now, I did not mention this other very important institutional approach to foster the quality of teaching. So let me only emphasize that research on teacher professional development provided comprehensive evidence on more or less successful approaches, less successful, for example, traditional courses and seminars, more successful approaches of professional learning communities, problem-solving cycles, lesson studies, and so on. I hope the colleagues in the room who have done excellent work in this field forgive me that I cannot go into details here. Teacher education, from my point of view, would be well advised to link training of research methods systematically with a training to deal with evidence. The competence model on this side shows a model of dealing with evidence that we in Munich, Johannes Bauer, Sandra Wenglein, Susanne Heininger, used in order to develop a training and test the effect in a controlled study. Our training can be seen as one step fostering the development of this kind of competence. We need, however, additional training modules to link the training with authentic problems, maybe such that students experience in their internships. From my opinion, again, here's another field where we should or could intensify our studies towards providing evidence for teacher education. In the beginning, I presented that slide showing problems of sustainability of teaching and learning in Germany on the secondary level in mathematics. 8 years later, another follow-up study of PISA 2012 came to very similar findings. The problem of differential progress still exists in my country, even though the whole picture of math performance, for example, has significantly improved compared to PISA 2003. These findings may demonstrate that certain problems we identify in our schools and classroom cannot be solved only by teacher education. The sustainability of teaching and learning depends, for example, on the curriculum, the kind of tests and assessment used normally in classrooms, the expectancies of parents and teachers, the culture, the tradition, the approaches of quality management, and so on. So my message is we have to intensify our research on teacher education. We need a broad range of studies and approaches to this. there are very good chances that evidence-based and evidence-oriented teacher education will have an important impact on the quality of teaching and learning. But we also have to keep in mind that we have to improve the system with a set of coherent measures. I've been talking about evidence-based practice, policy, and teacher education, but how can we appraise the situation at hand? I don't know how you are judging the situation in general or in your countries. I'm still wondering whether or how to classify the evidence orientation in education. Is it a kind of strategy? Is it a paradigm? Is it a movement? Are there real programs? How is the perception or understanding of evidence-based or evidence-oriented approaches in research, policy, and practice? Is it accepted? Is it shared? Is it coordinated? Is it funded? To what extent? Sometimes partially or largely. I tried to show my impression on this last slide. Maybe you are judging the situation differently, and I would be interested to hear about that. I'm also interested whether you see any alternatives to follow this way in the face of increasing relevance of education for society, in the light of grand challenges that also can only be mastered if we improve our education. These are my final questions, maybe for our discussion. But there's a last question at the end of my talk, and thank you much for your attention.
Okay, we have plenty of time now for some questions and discussions. If you want to ask a question or make a point, please can you stand up and then wait until one of the helpers from EARLI comes and brings you the microphone so that we can hear your question. Thank you.
Hello. One of the aspects that I couldn't see there that I wish to have your comment on is that the teacher education historically is related with the reproduction of the culture and the socialization of different societies. How could it play out in this process of evidence-based gathering and other things?
I think that is really an interesting problem, because there have been very different traditions in teacher education depending on secondary level, upper secondary level, primary level, and depending on the country. So there had been in some countries for primary education teacher training on the level of academies that was highly profession-oriented. And for the higher education on the secondary level, there were very different kinds of approaches. For example, stressing, first of all, the content knowledge. But when you have a look back, there, I would say that also in the history of empirical research, there had not been so much studies that focused models or concepts of teacher education. Maybe the reason for that is that the tradition is very strongly working. My feeling, for example, and I try to mention that, is that, for example, in our universities, teacher education is not seen as one of the important pillars. And although there's a tendency to include teacher students in the normal studies of physics, mathematics, or so on. And if we compare that, for example, with the field of medical education, you find a very different picture I think also in most of the European countries. So in medical education, during the last decades, there has been a strong tendency to orient the studies towards professional demands. And also, as I would say, there is a lot of interesting research in the field of medical education dealing exactly with a curriculum, with different forms of teaching and learning, with different kinds of assessment and so on. And here I sometimes feel a little bit disappointed because I think we as empirical educational researchers should be, first of all, we should be the experts for teaching in higher education. And in another field, in medical education, there are people really engaged in that area. So I think that was one of my messages. I think we have to do more research in the core of our duties, for example, in the universities.
Thanks. One problem that has been noted, certainly in the English-speaking world, about evidence and teacher education and policy is that there's not only a problem of relevant and useful research not perhaps being carried out or not getting into the teacher education world, but of what are sometimes called neuromyths and other distortions of evidence creeping into the media and sometimes into, indeed, teacher education. For example, things like programs like Brain Gym and other, the idea that there's a sharp difference between the left and right hemispheres as regards creativity and thought processes, the very rigid idea about sharply distinct visual, auditory and kinesthetic learning styles, etc. And I was wondering how one might perhaps make it easier to distinguish the almost real news from fake news, I suppose, with regards to educational evidence.
Yes, I think I can share your impression that there is a lot of so-called evidence coming from outside that is perceived and read and accepted in the public. But again, I would say that's our problem. We have to discuss critically, and we have to publish our findings that can help to critique or the simplistic or maybe even wrong concepts that are treated in media, for example. And you can also say that there's some kind of tendency towards more reductionist ideas of evidence. Someone is arguing that research is coming out of neurosciences will find more acceptance compared to someone who is saying the research comes out of educational or psychological research. And if you have a closer look on some of the published books on the relevance of neurosciences for learning, you will find a lot of evidence that has been already presented by psychology 40 years ago. And there we have to engage in the public debates. And I'm just wondering whether nobody is trying to write an interesting book, a very solid book for parents that could compete with books from other fields.
So I'm wondering what the implications of your claims are in terms of research funding. Because at the current moment, my feeling is that the incentives for research fundings go for doing yet another study, doing empirical research, investigating things empirically, but not so much for writing reviews, synthesis, and doing meta-analysis. So do we need another research funding system that provides more incentives for aggregating our empirical work and maybe reduce the effort that goes into conducting yet another study on things that probably have been researched before, but nobody knows about the study because hardly anybody's still able to read all that stuff that's being published in empirical journals?
I think that it's necessary to have funding instruments for these kinds of work, for example, to run meta-analysis that can be funded. For example, our German research foundation would fund these studies if they are of high quality. It depends a little bit on the funding systems. But what I also find is some kind of tendency towards a more program-oriented funding. At least in my country, there's a strong tendency that the Ministry of Education tends to have really program-oriented research that produces some kind of research synthesis. But I think we still need a balance. We have to keep the same or maybe an increasing amount for funding for basic research and for applied research. And we should not try to have some kind of competition between these different fields. We need both. But we need to argue that this money spent for more applied purposes, for example, research synthesis, or more transfer-oriented studies, or for more technology-oriented studies, is very important and could be very helpful for improving the education system during the next 10 or 15 years. And just as I heard here in Finland, for example, there's a tendency to cut the funding down. In our country, we do not have the same situation, but again, I would try to argue we also have to look for money on the European level. And I think questions of comparative studies in teacher education on the European levels could be very interesting and could be also funded by certain European organizations.
Yes, thank you for your talk. My concern more is about how this body of evidence gets translated and shared amongst the community. Fundamentally, I think what you've seen and was referring to is the growth in meta-analysis and what you might say clearer patterns of what kinds of practices we should be aiming for. But it seems to me that we as a teacher education community, and lots of people here are involved in teacher education, have a problem in that we all go off and do our own thing independently, okay, without referring and drawing on this evidence and agreeing on what are the kinds of common important points in the landscape that we should be introducing to all students at various stages. And that, I think, calls into question the nature of the practice and the profession that we are working in. And I'm wondering how you think that research can contribute to improving what we in teacher education are doing, rather than, you know, letting 1,000 flowers bloom and most of them wither.
I think that's a very interesting question, how to do research in a running system and doing research that can help to improve the running system. and also to do studies that are not simply located at your institution, that are studies that are coordinated, for example, between different institutions. But I think that's quite normal for education. I think we feel it at a university because we have both roles. We have the role of educator, and on the other hand, we have the role of researchers. Teachers in schools have only the role to teach. But I think that we should try to develop some kind of programs or strategies that could be oriented towards the most important problems we perceive in our institutions. I would say for my institution, there are a lot of problems, for example, to provide evidence to convince colleagues in other areas in the subjects, to convince our president, for example, of the need to change certain structures. And we also have problems to convince our ministry in our federal state to change or improve the assessment systems. So there are really hot problems from my perception. And I think it could be important to see whether these problems are shared in other universities, countries, and what can be done to have some kind of coordinated approach to provide, at least at certain points where we can have an impact, to provide their evidence.
Thank you very much for this talk. My question is, you have this evidence orientation in education, strategy program, paradigm, etc. The question I have is how teachers use evidence-based results. I mean, I can imagine maybe you have some concepts or some results about this, because often we have in education very good concepts, but the teacher reject to use the evidence-based results and then to change their teachings, to change their competences. Do you have some ideas about this?
At least from my experience, teachers tend to be interested in evidence when they perceive very strong problems in their everyday practical work. I think if everything is running smoothly, there is not an interest to be engaged in any of these things. I think that's one point. The second point is schools who are in some kind of movement, as a school that tries to define or understand itself in a certain way, can also be interested in evidence. My own experience was largely determined in our attempts now 15 years ago, where we tried to bring evidence into schools that had been highly shocked by the findings from PISA or TIMSS. And there was some kind of feeling that also the teachers perceived that they had a problem with the quality of the tasks they used in their math teaching. They perceived that they had problems with the experiments they did. They perceived that they had problems with some kind of, with the way students deal with mistakes or errors. They had the feeling that they had problems with supporting students to direct their learning, more or less. And at that time, we had the feeling that if we provided teachers with some structures where they could understand what kind of problems can be seen from a research perspective, that produced an interest to reflect their practice and also an interest to engage together and trying to develop other types of tasks, for example, or experiments. So I'm not pessimistic about that, but I think it depends a lot of the circumstances. And again, I would come back to the teacher education. I think it is necessary to show in the initial teacher education that the teacher, the students see that they can earn or they will benefit from a research perspective on understanding that what they are doing, and also in a way that they find new ways to reflect or to improve their everyday practice. But again, I would say it's a huge challenge for that. I mentioned the professional teacher development across the life space. So in many countries, I have the feeling that the institutions who should support these professional development are not working as they could do if they would be following the findings the research during the last decades has provided about effective professional development approaches.
So I would like to know, you were talking before about European comparison studies. This is a thing what I'm very interested in too. So my question is, first, which are the main factors you would suggest to control in these studies? Because we mentioned before these background factors in which the countries differ in many things. So this is my first question. What could be main background factors that should be controlled? My second question is, what can we do with the results afterwards? So if we have results about similarities or differences, so how can we deal with them so that we can implement these results into the schools? Thank you.
Thank you. I would say the first factor I think we have to control is the curriculum and the school system. Because as I mentioned, as far as I can see it, the Bologna process brought really some kind of harmonization of studies, but it's very structural. But the very interesting question from my point of view is the match between the teacher education, for example, at a university, the match with the structure you find in the schools. Maybe I'm wrong, but when we will have a look here in the Finnish system, we have a very different way in schools to make young teachers acquainted with the way lessons are taught, materials are used, styles are implemented. And I think that's, from my perception, very different compared to the culture or the way that has been done in my country. And I think that has to be controlled. The second point, it could be interesting to identify certain patterns or maybe similar patterns in teacher education across a number of European countries, not all, maybe a number. So I think it could be interesting to have a look on the Nordic countries. It could be interesting to have a look on countries with a different tradition of teaching and teacher education. For example, in Italy, Spain, or wherever. So can we find some certain kind of similarities that help us to interpret findings that they can be used or applied in this group of countries? I think it would be already very helpful to get a better understanding of the function and the quality.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I think my question might be a bit critical, but I think actually what we suffer the most from is that when we train pre-service teachers to be good teachers and then they come actually into practice, then they have so many models from the old school, so actually they just turn back. So whatever we are trying to do the best to give them research-based education, then they may just fall back. So do you have any suggestions how we could prevent this turning back to old school methods and old school visions of this is how it always was and this is how it has to be, because there's so much tradition, as the former speaker was already mentioning?
Yeah, I can understand your problem, but I would again come back to the question of system. I think changing only teacher education is not enough to have an impact in the school system. You have at the same time to think about to change professional development, you have to think about changes in the curriculum, you have to change about changes in the quality management. Maybe implementation of standards or guidelines or something like that. I think if we want to have a real effect, it's not enough to train teachers. But again, I would say, let me come back to the example of medical education. If we would change our teacher education system in a way that we have, we see it in the area of medical education, I would say that would already have a real impact in the everyday life, even if there are old school teachers. They will be confronted with a very different way, and that could also be supported by leadership programs and so on. I'm not so pessimistic, because otherwise the argument would be there is always some kind of old school and it doesn't make sense to try at least to change the system.
Do we have any final questions?
Coming back to your medical examples, if you have some problem with your bones, you wouldn't go to an ophthalmologist. And the problem is whether the model of teacher education as a general model is maybe the wrong model with regard to relevance. Maybe we need different departments of teacher education where we have, driven by the content, different ways to train teachers in their different areas. And maybe the main error of the whole concept of teacher education is that we believe it is a general concept of how to teach. Maybe we must teach our teacher students from the first semester on with regard to their content orientation. And if you see maybe psychological research with their neglect of the content dimension, then we have all these problems that we have to translate very, very generic research results to the special field of teacher education. And so far, I believe that we have to discuss the problem whether a general model of teacher education is the right one or whether we should replace it by very parallel systems of teacher education for the different content orientation.
I would say that would be a very interesting question to study in research. Why don't we try different approaches? For example, the suggested more department-oriented, content department-oriented compared to another. I think that would be interesting because we are doing, or we did some kind of teacher education already for 50 years. And it could be time to question whether other types could be stronger, better, more efficient. I think that are empirical questions.
I'd like to ask who the researchers are. I think there's a bit of a tendency to think about the evidence being somehow separate from teachers. You mentioned earlier the work of Lee Schumann, and I'd like to come back to that. Within the higher education domain, the work of Lee Schumann and Pat Hutchings in defining the scholarship of learning and teaching has basically pointed attention to the idea of teachers becoming researchers. And we have a bit of a problem, I think, in teacher education in that the higher education teachers need to be researchers, but also the student teachers need themselves to become researchers. And I think that's, I kind of hope that's what you're hinting at when you talk about professional development and research as professional development. The students must become researchers of their own practice. We must become researchers of our own practice. Using evidence of others is, of course, important, but I think we also need to research our own practice ourselves.
I would agree that teachers should have some kind of scientific perspective on their doing and to explore different possibilities and reflect and read and whatever. But I think, first of all, they are teachers and they need certain professional competencies. But I see some problem in attempts to merge the role of a teacher and a researcher. That had been done in action research, and from my point of view, it was not really successful. What I've been learning from medicine, for example, and that's the point that was for me interesting, to think about new types of work in between clinician scientists, for example, or medical scientists. So they're very different biographies. Someone coming from the clinic, becoming a researcher, can be a clinician scientist, but he will be a clinician scientist. Or someone coming from life sciences can become a medical scientist. We do not have so much people now in our teacher education that have some kind of competences in the way of a clinician scientist. That had been, in former times, colleagues who had been teachers for some time and developed after that, studying, doing research, a high expertise in both areas. They still know the practical work, but they developed a very different perspective on that. And I would say we need more of these colleagues who are in between, who have a different biography, and maybe we need, for example, in in medicine in my country, there are real programs for clinician scientists now. We could also have some kind of programs for teacher scientists, to have a certain group that could, for us as researchers and for the teachers, a very important group in between. And I think that could be a real, could make progress for that.
We have time for one more question.
Very nice presentation, and we got a lot of interesting ideas. Only one little question is how the PISA results impact on the initial teacher training institutions in Germany in some way?
I would say there was indirect effect, and it went across the experience that teaching matters, and also the experience that what some stakeholders in the beginning at PISA 2000 thought, we only have to change our structures. The first idea was we have to copy Finland. And this idea seemed to be not so successful because I mentioned the differences between the federal states, for example. But then the next point was to change teacher education. And now, 5 years ago, we have a new program, quality development in teacher education, with 500 million euros spent for the universities to improve, to do studies, to improve their teacher education. And I think the policy has understood that teacher education is really important, and they need to have more evidence and also more reform in the field of teacher education.
Okay, thank you all for your questions, and especially thank you once again to Manfred for this excellent presentation and also the excellent opportunity for us to discuss. I think we have a big takeaway here at the end. Teacher education is important. Congratulations.